the problem of preservation and archiving with a lot of these platforms, especially from an historical perspective, is also really alarming. And then
Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Glam Reaper podcast. I'm your host, Jennifer Muldowney, aka the Glam Reaper. And on today's episode, quite timely, I have a gorgeous author called Tamara who came out with a really interesting book called Death Glitch. So we're going to get into it today on all things tech and death. And let's hope there's no glitches in this podcast. So Tamara, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Jennifer.
So tell us a little bit about you, and not necessarily just all about the book, but tell us a little bit about you, your background, and, you know, who you are. Who's Tamara?
So I'm an academic primarily, and my background is in cultural anthropology, which is part of the reason why I became so interested in death as a subject matter. And I did a master's degree and a PhD. My PhD was in media studies, and so I did a lot of work on digital cultures and trying to understand the different kinds of subcultures attached to the internet, including very weird ones and ones that were quite ephemeral and part of web history, but maybe didn't continue on into the contemporary moment. And I also have worked in the tech industry, and I was at Intel in a couple of different roles, and primarily my research focus within the tech and policy nonprofit world is very much focused on the ethics of technologies, including AI, and the matter of sustainability. And increasingly, my work on death and my work on climate tend to intersect. And so thinking about what happens to the data of the dead is also very much tied to thinking about data storage and the role of data centers and the power of tech companies over people's data when they're alive and then also when they're dead. And so I do a lot of writing and tend to write for a lot of different kinds of audiences. And yeah, I would say that the other thing about me is that I'm very interested in dead media forms. So a lot of vinyl records and also vintage clothing is one of my passions. And I worked in vintage shops all throughout graduate school. And maybe the other part of me that is worth mentioning is that I have a background as a labor organizer and was very active in my graduate student union, faculty union as a professor, and am very engaged in tech worker union movements and other labor organizations around tech. So, and that I think is also a thread that comes out in the book.
Very cool. Well, I mean, that is a decorated resume, as they would say over here in the States. That's amazing. And we've actually, you and I have a lot of crossed paths there because, you know, I own a memorial planning business. I'm from Ireland. I'm here in the States about 9 years now, 10 years, I think it actually is this year. I keep saying 9. I keep living in the past. But I've always, aside from that, and my, you know, advocacy for pre-planning your own funeral, I've always been absolutely fascinated with the industry or the death space impact on our digital legacies and then the environment. I've worked with companies, I've consulted with people all along my kind of travels, my own decorated resume, where I've gotten kind of, a snapshot into that. It's just so fascinating. And I want to get into that more. Your book, Death Text, I'm going to show it here. So again, because of my fascination with it, it's called Death Glitch, How Techno-Solutionism Fails Us in This Life and Beyond. It's not for everybody, you know, it is one of those books that you kind of have to be interested in. I think everyone in the funeral space should read it, honestly, just to have the knowledge. But there's a lot of things I think a lot of people in the funeral space should do and they don't. But because it's just so fascinating. Now, the first thing I thought of, because I've read a couple of these types of books, yours was extremely thorough though. And you could tell you had that research background. And you can see I have so many notes and dog ears in it. A very well-used, well-read book. And that's mainly because, honestly, I just recently spoke about AI and death. AI and grief. And we have that video on our YouTube channel and you can find it on the website. But it was a panel of us, which was interesting. So I was kind of representing the funeral space. And then we had I was about to say an estate attorney, but no, she was from the legal side of it. She was an estate attorney, but she was from the legal aspect of sort of what your digital legacy can do. And then we had an engineering data analyst. And so we were coming from three very different sort of spaces, but we were all kind of pretty much singing off the same hymn sheet. But in my research for that, I kind of wanted to absorb as much as possible. And one of the things that I wanted to ask you while I have you is in the books that I've read, and even in the things I've written myself in this space, isn't it wild how just fastly out of date everything becomes? Like people have often said to me when they see sort of on my LinkedIn, I'll say my 3 pillars are pre-planning or, planning your own funeral, digital legacy, and the environment. And people will often say, why don't you specialize? Why never did you specialize in digital? And I'm like, because it changes so fast. It's crazy. So you're talking in this book a lot about the past and your experiences and case studies with that. And there is one major one I want to talk about because I feel very strongly about it. How do you feel about that? Or what's,
I mean, so as an academic researcher, that's par for the course. So if you're going to be studying digital cultures, they're going to be shifting all the time.
Yeah.
And I think, I wrote the book, certainly it's, an academic press book. It was intended to be my tenure book had I stayed in my academic job. And so I was more concerned about reaching academic audiences and ensuring that it would be taken seriously in those circles. But I did also want it to be accessible to people who were not academics and who didn't care about particular forms of media theory. But I think part of it is that I wasn't necessarily intending it to be a how-to or a guide, and that's in part because of how quickly things change. And so trying to accommodate the pace at which these technologies and just all of the infrastructures and cultures around them change over time, it would be so hard to capture that in anything connected to academic publishing because it takes years.
Yeah.
And so, there's a year gap between me turning in the final copy edits and the book being printed.
Yeah.
And so when people say, generative AI was not really a hot topic.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yet I kept having to work in new references as I worked on this project from 2007 onward. But for me, I mean, it's a history.
Yeah. And it is very much like that. And that's what I found so interesting is discovering sort of how a lot of these things came to power. And I know, so I've written books as well. And that's one of the parts of me that I was like, oh my God, but like from the second you turn it in and it's the final copy and final edit, it's at least a year before it hits the shelves. So it's one of those things, and probably because it's digital, why would you put it in maybe physical form, honestly? So it's that was kind of top of mind. And as I said, I've read the other books and stuff. But what I thought was, what I found fascinating was, as I said, the history and you coming at it from, a very different brain to my own, really, because I am not scholarly. Well, I don't think, I wouldn't consider myself that, but I could tell that was the purpose of your book. And I just found it so fascinating. Like, I never knew that really the beginning of Facebook, Meta, we'll call it, their start into memorial pages started with Virginia Tech. But then, when I was reading that, I was like, of course, because, it makes sense. Like when I think of even my own timeline with Facebook and then, of course, all of these digital powerhouses are developing as these crucial things are happening. Facebook coming out with the emergency, like letting people know you're safe and that sort of stuff. So how was it researching all that? Did you find people easy to talk to?
Yeah, by and large, I started feeling a bit uncomfortable with the idea of interviewing people who are in mourning for my book.
Yes.
So I don't like the idea of being extractive in that way. And I think that tends to be an issue within especially academic research, but also in industry-based research. But at least, I wasn't working on creating a product for people to use or creating something that was maybe of any kind of tangible benefit. And so that's why a lot of my work is more focused on the people who are creating companies. And so the startup ecosystem and understanding the motivations behind that, I felt much more comfortable doing that kind of work, particularly around something very sensitive like death, care, and mourning, which isn't to say that I didn't, participate in things like Death Salon and, kind of obviously did interview people who were the spouses of people who had died of cancer and maintaining their illness blogs and all of those things. But I found it easier to interview people who were maybe already publicly writing about those things as well. And so it was something that they already felt comfortable putting out there. And that's very different to cite people as kind of other people in the field, other journalists, other writers, other people who are thinking about this in a personal, but also maybe a somewhat abstracted way, rather than, being like like a Harold and Maude, like turning up at people's funerals. To find people to interview.
I understand. There's quite a few books in the funeral space, but even for me in my own business, honestly, and it's something I'm toying with a lot lately. It's, I've this nickname that I got from the media after my first book, The Glam Reaper, which is great. And it's a little bit of fun and stuff, but you have to be so cognizant of the business we work in, and if I lost my mom, like, what am I, do you want somebody who's fun putting and I hate this, the fun back into funeral and stuff like that? And to me, I very much of the school of thought that a funeral is both for the living and the deceased. It should be a tribute and it should be cathartic for the living, but it's finding that fine line where social media, all of that sort of marketing, it is really, really difficult. My one of the major things I really wanted to talk to you about, or that I feel very passionate about, that was definitely highlighted in all your research, is since I've started, and I've been in this business 15 years now, probably more, and I've seen so many businesses come and go. So many. Some of them have contacted me to be a brand ambassador or to just help them enter the field or whatever it is. I've seen so many, I've helped many, and I've seen so many come and go, and the startup culture is real. And I don't even know what the percentage is, but I think it's like 70% or something fail startups within the first 3 years, something like that. Anyway, something crazy. And that of course will apply to the funeral space. Why wouldn't it? But the problem with that is that you have all these families, mourning families, who are putting their trust in you, and then all of a sudden 3 years later you're gone, you're bankrupt, you're whatever. Now my biggest ick, if you like, or my biggest problem with that, and we have had a couple of people interviewed on the Glam Reaper podcast, and as I say to them all, I'm like, I wish you well and I hope you succeed, because I just think of all the crushed families left behind. But it's these memorial pages or these companies who start, we're going to be the Facebook for the dead. We're going to be the Instagram for the dead. We are, we're your memorial page online, your obituary online. And there's so many of them that have come and gone. And that data is just poof, it's heartbreaking. And you really touch on that in the book. You mention a lot of them. How do you feel about that? Or what's your kind of take on that? Obviously, I've read the book, so I know, but...
Yeah, I mean, it is upsetting because there is a need for it. And so people do keep trying to create new versions of these companies because the large platforms, the tech companies, are still failing to bridge that gap. And the law has been very slow in catching up. And of course, US, we also have very limited things like data privacy and things that are in effect in Europe do not matter in the US. And so figuring out the differences between international law and different cultural rituals, and even in the US state by state differences. And so and that's why the person who I interview in the book, who is an estate planning attorney, but who also has worked in tech, she worked at Twitter. So Megan Yip, and all of her work on estate planning and her ability to create plans for people that will endure, in part because you're legally obligated as an attorney to carry forward these plans. But, she and I have had many conversations about the fact that there is still a need. There are services that large tech companies do need. particularly those that don't even have any kind of memorialization policy in place. And I think something that she has also really been firm about is the fact that it isn't just death, it's also when people become incapacitated.
Yeah.
Thinking about aging, and with a large demographic of people, the baby boomers who are now aging, and some people may not die right away, but if they are no longer able to manage their accounts and their children or next of kin need to be able to access them, this will be a big problem. And so we've talked about different ways of, what can be done? How do you package services, and how do you figure out how to deliver something that would make this easier on people, but that maybe isn't totally a startup model? Like maybe this is where a kind of cottage industry of consultants or people who are doing policy at nonprofits like mine. This is also where they might come in to help kind of shape internal tech policies around this kind of issue.
Yeah.
It seems like something that responsible AI teams, in fact, should be looking at, the death use case, but I think they're so overwhelmed by work right now. And this is part of the issue too, is just that within tech companies, this is not a subject that is being prioritized. It is not something that is being well funded and well staffed.
Yeah. And with kind of good reason, in some respects. Like, I've often thought, like, if I put myself at the top of a tech company like Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, they're about living and life and the moments and the memories. That's what they're about collecting. They're not focused on, sure, didn't Elon Musk, when he bought over Twitter, didn't he cull all the profiles or something like that? Like, he just got rid? Wild.
Yeah, the problem of preservation and archiving with a lot of these platforms, especially from an historical perspective, is also really alarming. And then the fact that a lot of people still don't have any plan for their own possessions and haven't really thought that through and don't have any way of documenting it.
Yeah.
And so I do think that the services that seem to be a little bit longer lasting are those that provide mortuary care and will writing, planning, and other end of life protocols on top of the digital housekeeping aspect.
Yeah, because it's, as we talked about at the panel discussion on AI, and as I said, I could have talked for hours and hours about it because there's so many different aspects. There's so many different facets we could have talked about. Like we talked about history, and I'm like, reenacting my grandmother who's passed away, I may not want that. Like, that might be horrific for me. I just don't want it. Ooh, creepy. But to another person, that might not be the case. And then you think, okay, but historically. So my great-great-great-great-great-grandmother, if she was in, I don't know, the Battle of Hastings or something, wouldn't it be incredible to sort of, reenact her memories, or somehow, like, for me to hear her voice that I never heard in real life? So, there's so many pros and cons to it, and a lot of it is an emotional attachment to it. Like one of the conversations that came out in the panel discussion was, well, what right do we have to celebrities? And I had to be the sort of I brought it back to being human. I said, yeah, you might think Whitney Houston, we deserve to sort of have access to her voice forever. But I mean, she's a human being. She was a daughter. She was a mom. Like, she's all these things. We don't get a right just because somebody's in the public arena. We don't get a right to them. But then there's that argument of, well, do we? And, what do you sell your soul, if you become a celebrity and all that sort of stuff. But then it kind of comes back to pre-planning. And, I do have a PDF document, and it touches on digital a little bit, but it's like your passwords, you financially, you might have investments in music. You might have books you've bought online. Where do all they go? Your digital profiles, do you want them kept up? Do you want them turned into memorial pages? Do you want them taken down? Maybe you're an influencer. So where's that money going? Like, are they going to use your likeness for years to come? Like several celebrities. I mean, didn't they bring Audrey Hepburn back from the dead in some ad? Your thoughts in your blogs, this podcast, long after we're gone, Tamara, maybe they'll, take our heads and voices and put them somewhere. Maybe not.
I think if they could make a buck from it, they would.
Yeah. Well, that's the scary thing. I mean, I joked at the panel discussion, but it was deadly serious, where I had a conversation with my parents because I said, this is, the world is kind of getting scarier. And I said, if you ever get a phone call, somebody saying they have me kidnapped, it did elicit quite a bit of a laugh. I said that if they have me kidnapped and they're demanding $10,000, which is really not a lot, but anyway, if they're demanding $10,000, my dad would probably say keep her, that they'll soon return me. But I said to them, I said, you might hear my voice, but it might not actually be my voice. So now we have a secret code question that they have to ask me and I have to validate it and stuff like that. But that's the world we're living in.
Absolutely. Yeah, the capacity for deception and for scams has only increased. And I do think this problem of being able to say plainly, I don't want my likeness or my digital assets or anything about me used in this particular manner. But it is so hard too, because to preempt what future technologies will be. And so for quite a while now, we've had this issue of people, the sort of Tupac hologram phenomenon or other cases of reviving celebrities, even earlier. Like, you don't even need digital technology to do that entirely. There are other kinds of splicing techniques that you can use. But now with generative AI, there is this notion that it can be universalized, that it could happen to anyone. And the notion that there are so many terrible use cases for it, really. Yeah. And so to be able to have control over these things in the future is something that I think if people do think about these things, they would find it quite disturbing.
Yeah, and there will always be, on every post, there'll always be somebody who comments, "Sure, I'll be dead, who cares?" and that sort of thing. And look, we understand that it's, you've only got so much control. Once you pass away, unfortunately, you've only got so much control. And a lot of that falls into your family or your next of kin or whoever you've nominated as hands. But it is a scary thing, and it's something we do need to address. I was really watching an episode of Criminal Minds there recently. I've started rewatching it, where I know it's a fictional show, but it just highlighted to me what can be done. And they obviously deal with criminals, but one of the detectives or FBI agents or whatever they're called, she appeared on the dark web in pornography. And it was not her, obviously, but it was her likeness attached to somebody else's body. And that's why a lot of parents I know are afraid to put their children's faces out on the web, on social media and stuff like that, because there's that fear of child porn and stuff. But it's just having control over our voices, our face, our likeness. Yeah, the scary thing is, I don't know in my lifetime, honestly, if the law is going to catch up with it. Because as you just said, in these companies, these hugely growing companies, most of them are just concerned with the bottom line and satisfying their client, their target audience. And their target audience, and therefore them and their finances, are not concerned with death, because then you're not, you don't exist to them anymore. They can't sell you anything anymore. And that's a tragedy. It's crazy. And, for my funeral folk that are out there listening, because I know we have, my audience of this is sort of funeral folk, but it's also people who just sort of are interested in the crazy things I talk about. I know for me, for my client, for the most part, I recommend my families, we do a personal website for the person, as opposed to using any of these startup companies. And I kind of hate saying that, but it's not, and I would never discourage somebody from using one of them, but it's just that fear that I don't want to put my clients through the pain of, in 3 years' time, I have to say to them, when they go looking for it and they're saying, "Jen, where's my website?" and then it's not there. So at least a personal website, we can transfer to them. It's up to them if they want to keep it going. If they want to let it go, they can download everything. But again, even that part of me goes, yeah, but what if the internet just explodes one day and that's gone, Oh, God. It's a lot to think about this time of day, Tamara.
Yes. I mean, yeah, certainly the shakiness of the undersea cables and crews of people who are trying to maintain them is always somewhat alarming. But I think, you can only really do the best with what you can control.
Exactly. And I do think if any big tech companies are listening to us out there, I think the one thing we would both ask is that there be some, even if it's one person in the department, in the death tech department. So like Facebook, have people looking out for this, taking care of it, creating some sort of okay, what do we do when this person dies?
Yeah, absolutely. Memorialization should be part of trust and safety.
Yeah.
It should be part of responsible AI. There has to be a way of integrating it into companies, especially large ones.
Yeah.
And it is alarming that even a lot of quite large companies don't have a real policy in place.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, on that kind of depressing note, thank you so much, Tamara. This was super interesting. I hope everybody's as obsessed with this as I am. Like, I'm just fascinated with it, and I could talk to her for days. But definitely get her book if you're in any way interested in it, because it's just super interesting, and it just looks at everything, I think, from a bit of a historical point of view, but just the background, the why, and the fact, you've interviewed so many people and stuff. It's just really, really interesting. And I Googled so many of them, and, I learned quite a bit from it. So thank you for writing the book. Thank you for coming on the Glam Reaper podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This was great.